We are back for part two of our special two-part look back at the year, the first year of the Donald Trump administration. We still have our Christmas jumpers and Christmas ties on, even though Christmas is pretty much over there. It's time to start 2026 in glory style. Let's just keep going through the months for last year. If we look at July kicked off the second half of this first year of President Trump's administration, kind of similarly to how it all began in January, because you had great excitement, I guess, around the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill, the signature piece of legislation from President Trump. But you also had just hours later that desperate tragedy in Texas with that flooding at Camp Mystic that killed over 130 people, dozens of them children. So again, where the celebration of the inauguration had been followed by that awful plane crash here in Washington, D.C., you had the celebration of the One Big Beautiful Bill, and then suddenly the president had to turn his thoughts to a whole state, a whole nation that was grieving over the loss of these children. Because if we look at the One Big Beautiful Bill, which was signed into law on July 4th, Independence Day, very choreographed, as so much of what this president does is, that was really so much of his economic policy, wasn't it? It was about preserving those tax breaks that he put in place in his first administration, but also so much controversial parts to that bill as well, rolling back healthcare for millions and millions of Americans, which we are still talking about now in an effort to try and preserve the healthcare subsidies. Also changes to education grants, to housing credits, to housing energy credits, environmental regulations, ending e-vehicle credits, which was another controversial one. Plus points from President Trump's campaign promises, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. But for me, it really showed President Trump's ability to whip the Republican Party. I mean, we saw all those late night phone calls, that real pressure campaign that he mounted on members of the House and the Senate to get that bill over the line, because that was this big piece of law that he needed to get done for his campaign. Then you get to the end of the month, another fresh controversy again on Capitol Hill, with the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, sending home members of the House of Representatives early to their summer holidays. Critics say he did that to try and get away from the Jeffrey Epstein files and a vote that was looming. That controversy, of course, has chased President Trump ever since he came back into office. It was something he and so many of his supporters had really pledged on the campaign trail to release those files, and it's kind of haunted him ever since.
Katrina, it's amazing to see how long the legs are of those stories that you mentioned. We're still talking about the Epstein files, and we're still talking about, as you said, healthcare, SNAP benefits, which were cut in that One Big Beautiful Bill Act and came back into the conversation with the government shutdown, which we'll get to in the later months. But all of these issues are still very, very present. Heading on to August, it was absolutely unexpected when we started the month of August, which is supposed to be the lazy, quiet Washington month, the dog days of summer. Certainly was not when the White House announced that President Trump would be hosting Vladimir Putin in Alaska. That started this kind of scramble of action, certainly in our newsroom and across the BBC for journalists as well. But a lot of criticism of President Trump for hosting President Putin in Alaska. But the White House said, look, this is a real effort at getting peace and moving forward on peace negotiations. So a bunch of us, from the Washington office and also many of our colleagues from the Ukrainian and Russian service, we went to Alaska, landed there, and the anticipation was building really the entire day before. And you get to that day, and I will never forget that moment when we saw Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin get down from their planes. Donald Trump had arrived earlier. He waited for Vladimir Putin to arrive. And those images of him standing at the crossing of those red carpets, waiting for Vladimir Putin, applauding him, giving him a warm handshake. They walk together, get in the beast together. I mean, a lot of us we caught our breath kind of watching those images together. And then we see them go into the base where they're holding the talks. And that also incredibly remarkable press conference, which wasn't actually a press conference because they didn't take any questions. But you saw President Trump very complimentary of Vladimir Putin, vice versa. And at the end of it, we heard Vladimir Putin say in English, maybe next time in Moscow. And Donald Trump said, oh, I might get some heat for that.
Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening.
But it was met with so much dismay from Ukrainians, Europeans who saw this as an absolute gift to Vladimir Putin, and the fact that President Trump hadn't, in their eyes, pressured him enough. And we know, obviously, since then that really spurred Europeans into action. What we saw just a few days later, they all gathered at the White House with Volodymyr Zelensky to avoid the similar scene that we saw in February, that type of blow up at the White House. And that was one of the busiest days I've seen at the White House. The other part of August that really stands out to me is we saw the deployment of National Guard troops here in the city we live in Washington, D.C. We had seen those federal troops sent to Los Angeles, but this was different because this wasn't necessarily to deal with protests, but rather to deal with what the Trump administration called rampant crime, homelessness, clearing out, homeless encampments. There was a lot of fear in the city, and we still see those National Guard troops on the streets here. We had that horrific shooting of 2 National Guard members in November, but it has changed a bit the landscape of the city, hasn't it? And also the debate around the use of federal troops in a city like this one.
To me, these stories really, felt like holdovers from the first Trump administration. We saw, it reminds me of when Donald Trump met Vladimir Putin in his first administration and in front of reporters went against his own intelligence community to say that he believed that Vladimir Putin did not meddle in the U.S. election, right? And it struck the same tone that we saw in Alaska. And then also with, his decision to send National Guard troops to D.C. and later into other cities. That was also something during, in the run up to 2020, we heard him decry about the blue-led cities where the crime was rampant. And this was a point in which he could actually enact the plans that he had talked about, really, in his first administration. So, again, this felt very much like vintage Trump to me.
Well, if that's vintage Trump, something that perhaps is not vintage Trump is what we saw happening in September, that again we're still talking about now, which is these strikes on boats coming from Venezuela. The administration says they are narco-terrorists. We have yet to see evidence of that publicly, see evidence anyway. And these are fishermen by other accounts, Venezuelan trawlers and so on. We've seen a whole pile of things happen, but it began in September and we're still focused, aren't we, on that event of the 2nd of September, that strike, the so-called double tap strike, where the first strike partially blew up the ship and then there were 2 survivors and there was a second strike that killed them. And we have seen lots of controversial fallout from that I suspect will carry on right through the next year as well. Also in September, talking about shocking and tragic events that had happened through the year, we saw the assassination of Charlie Kirk, basically live on television. The event was being live streamed at the time while he was addressing a rally of mostly students at the Utah Valley University. Charlie Kirk, of course, the political activist, also entrepreneur, podcaster, founder of Turning Point USA, very conservative. He'd be labelled right-wing in terms of many of the views that others would find controversial that he holds. But his assassination in that way, in a rally, led to the resurgence, I guess, of this debate about violent political rhetoric and what's the right to free speech versus the right to not incite hatred. We've seen so much of that over the last year. Of course, what we didn't mention in June was the assassination of a former Minnesota State Senator, Melissa Hortman, and her husband. We also saw an arson attack on the home of the governor of Pennsylvania. And not least last year, of course, those 2 assassination attempts on President Trump himself. Also in September, we had the United Nations General Assembly gathered in New York. I was up there, and this was quite fascinating. When we're talking about all of these threads of foreign policy that we've seen from this administration, that gathering began with many nations, allies of the US, recognizing the state of Palestine. Of course, not the US, not Israel, but there was huge pressure there about moving on. We had no ceasefire deal at that time. So moving on the talks to try and end the incredible suffering that was happening at that point inside Gaza, and efforts to free the remaining hostages who were being held by Hamas Israeli hostages at that time as well. And on the sidelines of the UNGA, we saw the president meet with many Arab and Muslim leaders, which seems to have helped push things towards then a deal that was reached with Netanyahu and eventually reached with Hamas as well, although still not obviously peace there at this point. Also on the sidelines, you had that meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, which we've been talking about for the entirety of this recap. However, after that meeting, President Trump very firmly in the Ukrainian camp, posting that he thought Ukraine could actually take some Russian territory, as well as pushing back Russia out of its occupied territory. So another very dramatic month in September, and that's not even all that happened.
I think the Trump's comments on Ukraine taking back its territory again took everyone by surprise, and since then he's again seems to have reversed course on that regard. I think also at the end of the General Assembly there were still a lot of questions about whether how far he was from getting peace over the line in Gaza and how much influence he actually had over Netanyahu's government. But then in October, we did see Netanyahu come here to the White House and announce that plan, which, perhaps more than most other things, President Trump very much sees that as his most successful negotiation of the year, perhaps, in that, he, it's still at the as of now very tenuous, but he really did see himself as the peacemaker in this situation, and that's when we really saw talk of the Nobel Prize, for example, really start to ramp up. That same month, though, he was perhaps, at least initially, slightly less successful in negotiating because we saw the beginning of a 43-day government shutdown, over disagreements and the Congress's inability to come to an agreement over a funding deal. And at least initially, there was, very little room for negotiation. Neither Trump and the Republicans nor the Democrats seemed very content to really sit down and find any sort of common ground, at least in those first few weeks, as we saw hundreds of thousands of federal workers be furloughed or laid off, and government essentially come to a standstill, which I think really kind of captivated American attention, at least for those 43 days, because after all, it was the first time in 7 years and the longest. That month, we also had news of the East Wing demolition, which has been really controversial here in Washington, and is something that at least Courtney and I, every time we go into the White House now, we still see it in motion, as it were.
Do you miss it? Do you miss the East Wing?
I think there's an argument to be made for them needing space, but there are obviously a lot of questions about how this was all done,
which is before the courts at the moment.
I miss it this time of year because this is the time of year where the First Lady
with the decorations.
Yes, exactly. And you walk through and you get, walk down the hallway, which no longer exists. So it was, I do miss it at this point.
Well, we're told the replacement will be bigger and better. So we'll wait to see that development concluded.
We shall see. That's right. In November, actually, I think what started out as a win for the administration, as Byrne mentioned, they were in the midst of one of the longest shutdown in U.S. history at 43 days. The Democrats finally gave in. We saw them 8 senators cross the aisle, moderate senators cross the aisle to vote with Republicans. And of course, this was all, held up on the Democratic demand that the Republicans extend the healthcare subsidies under the Affordable Care Act, which are still due to expire at the end of the year for millions of Americans. But the pain points on the federal workers, on the administration's decision to freeze funding for supplemental food programs, really just stood to be too much, I think, for these senators. And so they ultimately voted to extend the funding through January 30th. So of course we'll be here again in the new year, but it seemed like a win for, the administration. Unfortunately, I think the rest of the month, unfortunately for them, the rest of the month, we started to see cracks in the president's grip on power through a couple of other big moments. And that was with the off-year elections in Virginia, New Jersey, and the mayoral election in New York, where Zohran Mamdani won, the self-proclaimed Democratic Socialist, who would later visit the White House, and the president seemed very charmed by.
But I just want to congratulate. I think you're going to have hopefully a really great mayor. The better he does, the happier I am. I will say there's no difference in party. There's no difference in anything. And we're going to be helping him to make everybody's dream come true, having a strong and very safe New York. And congratulations, Mr. Mayor.
But in Virginia and New Jersey, we saw two centrist Democrats with national security backgrounds win. And the through line on all three of these elections was that these candidates were very disciplined in talking about affordability, about cost of living, and that seems to have laid out a playbook for the party in next year's midterms. But we also saw the administration sort of admit, shortcomings here on that issue in particular, and the president has since, taken a big interest and tried to start talking about this in events around the country. And the other sort of major moment in November for I think all of us was the House and the Senate voting on the release of the Epstein files, the long-awaited release of the Epstein files, which, as Katrina said, has just dogged Donald Trump since he took office, because he had pledged to release these while on the campaign trail. We saw both the House and the Senate vote to release this. The president obviously had resisted it up until this point, but then eventually relented and signed the act into law. But this is a moment where we saw the president really campaign to try and stop this release, but it seemed inevitable, and of course was. And November looked, maybe wasn't as much of a win as they thought it was going to be.
And to your point, Courtney, November ended out perhaps on a more difficult note for the Trump administration, for President Trump, than he would have liked. And guess what? Here we are in December. We made it to the end of the year, and we're talking about affordability, the economy. It feels a lot like 2024, doesn't it? Because all of us were covering the campaign, and all the voters we were speaking to were telling us about the cost of living, the cost of groceries, the cost of housing, of health care, of child care. And for the president, after that November election day, his team has now seen that this message on affordability is one that is resonating with voters. And that's why we saw the president take to the former campaign trail, now holding another rally. He was in Pennsylvania, speaking about the economy and affordability.
But Democrats talking about affordability is like Bonnie and Clyde preaching about public safety.
That was what he was intended to speak on. In the end, he has used again and again the words hoax and con job when talking about affordability.
And I can't say affordability hoax, because I agree the prices were too high, so I can't go to hoax because they'll misconstrue that. But they use the word affordability, and that's their only word. They say affordability, and everyone says, oh, that must mean Trump has high prices. No, our prices are coming down.
I've spoken to Republicans who say the president's not calling affordability or cost of living a hoax. He's calling it a hoax that the Democrats say it's the Republicans or President Trump's fault. They say it was Joe Biden, the previous presidency, that created the conditions that President Trump is now trying to fix. All in all, it's been a difficult message for the White House to cut through on. So my, very safe prediction for 2026 is that the midterm elections are again going to be dominated by this issue.
It's interesting how in the 2024 election campaign it was cost of living, and now it's affordability, but it's exactly the same thing that people are talking about, isn't it? And the economic indicators are the way they are. It hasn't been, I think, probably the great transformation that President Trump and his team were hoping for when it comes to the economy. I mean, the figures at the end of December were showing inflation still around where it was at the start of the year, and the unemployment rate actually ticking up even a little bit. So there's no running away from that. And you can't unlink tariffs either from all of that. I mean, in December, we also saw that bailout package for crop farmers, didn't we? $12 billion set aside, really short term, to be paid by the end of February, to literally help farmers get through the higher input costs for their farming, which they would say, all of them have said, are kind of linked to tariffs and a couple of other issues as well, but wouldn't be there without the tariffs.
We also in December saw Trump kind of acknowledge in a very rare admission that things might not necessarily go his way and the way of the Republicans in the midterms. I mean, you very rarely see Trump kind of even acknowledge the possibility that something won't go in his favor. But in December, we did see him kind of in what I thought was a very honest moment say that, because of the affordability issue, this might be a problem next in 2026, which was out of character, I thought.
Lightning round, guys, your thoughts for 2026. What are you going to be looking out for?
For me, I'm going to be watching out for those rifts in the Republican Party continuing. We saw a valley develop over the Epstein files. We're seeing something similar develop over the handling of the economy. I think the more National Guard troops we see in major cities as well is going to become a greater flashpoint for people. So how much President Trump can still maintain that control that we saw him exercise over the party in the first part of 2025, can he keep that heading into the midterms?
I'll be interested to see how much the president refocuses his attention on domestic issues. We saw the administration sort of acknowledge, as you said, Bern, that, maybe they needed to pivot to this affordability issue. We heard the Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, say the president was going to travel around the country like it was 2024 all over again. And we've already gotten a hint of that. And so I'll be interested to see how much of his attention he'll be paying to more domestic policy, even as he's trying to get issues of, foreign policy issues over the finish line, like the Ukraine-Russia deal and other foreign policy goals. So it should be a pretty interesting year in terms of how they plan to juggle things.
Mine is quite similar in that I'm looking forward to seeing, just how effective Trump being back in campaign mode is, and whether or not he still has the same influence over the Republican base that people have assumed he has for the last 10 years. I think, for example, if this affordability issue continues to plague him, we might find that he doesn't, and that having Trump on the ballot himself isn't as effective as it was last year or in the past. And I think that's kind of going to be the big question for the White House this year is, just how much does his force of personality still influence local and state races?
And I actually will be looking at what the Democrats do. You get the sense that they feel like they've gotten their groove back a little bit after that November election, that they're hammering the president on affordability. But if they don't have their own message on how they would solve the problem, they're going to have a tough time. And with the president out possibly campaigning, if his name is attached to the ballot and he drives out the vote on election day in 2026, then it could be pretty difficult for the Democrats. I'm going to be looking out for that.
And everything else besides that no doubt will happen across 2026 that we can't predict at all as per 2025. But we'll be here, won't we, every week on The President's Path?
See you all this year, guys.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.